Hi, it's Arjun with a video podcast following up on last week's post heralding the rise of the energy pragmatism era. No more inverting our hierarchy of needs with nonsensical net zero is all that matters energy outlooks that would have subjugated billions of people, vast swaths of humanity, to ongoing poverty. We've moved into what we really believe is an exciting and perhaps even fun new time for energy and all things energy, the new stuff, the old stuff, everything in between. We have oil and gas converging with the power sector. We have tech and energy conversion driven by the fact that the former tech does not exist without the latter energy, as tech companies, leading tech companies, have begun to appreciate. We have billion-person scale economies in the developing world that are going to do what they need from their perspectives to ensure their citizens move up those economic and therefore energy S-curves. Economic growth and energy growth are absolutely synonymous with one another. And it will be those regions and their focus on reliability, geopolitical security, and affordability that will motivate an increasingly diverse mix of energy sources and technology. This isn't about looking backwards. It is about the path forward. Now, this week's video is going to start our discussion on where are the opportunities for companies and others to invest, what regions have been left behind, and where a newfound bout of pragmatism could create new opportunities that didn't exist over the past 5 to 10 years. How can we best meet the substantial unmet energy needs of all 8 billion people on Earth, not just the lucky 1 billion of us that live the kind of lives that we all now take for granted? Real economics are returning, and we are moving away from unsustainable, rich country government handouts to the wealthiest amongst us for technologies that are not ready for prime time. Welcome to the energy pragmatism era. So I want to start with a quick look back on how Super Spiked has evolved its key themes, because it's really, last week was my 100th written post, as I noted. This is actually our 60th video to go along with that. But from when we started Super Spiked with post 1 to where we are now with post 100 and now this video is really a remarkable evolution. We started in November of 2021 with the tagline, "A messy energy transition era arrives." And it was our commentary and our motivation to push back on what we thought was really a nonsensical approach to energy, that somehow we could transition quickly off of fossil fuels only into renewables over some arbitrarily short time frame, mainly by disincentivizing oil, gas, coal, and nuclear only in friendly areas, the US, Canada, and Europe. None of that made sense. High and volatile prices were going to be the outcome. We weren't actually going to transition. And by the way, none of it was going to be good for our environment, including climate perspectives. And you were going to leave vast swaths of humanity behind. All of that we push back on. We push back on the idea that traditional oil and gas companies should have to transition to the new stuff. That never made sense, as I think is bearing out. All of that is why we are here today. But by March of 2023, which was when we joined Veriton and unretired, as we say, we'd already moved to, okay, not only are we pushing back on it, but now we're going to explicitly call for the, quote, energy transition to transition. The path the world was on, we knew was not a good one, but now is about trying to figure out what should be the path forward. And by the end of 2024, we declared that the energy transition, the very narrow definition off of fossil fuels only into renewables by 2050, was dead. It never made sense in the first place. And with it, we are now emerging, we're going to say, into this new era of energy pragmatism. It's actually, frankly, quite an evolution. Kind of every year and a half, 2 years, the themes in the macro are evolving. I think they're evolving in a favorable direction. But if we can look ahead to a future theme, and we hope someday this will be true and a true statement we can make in Super Spiked, that is that everyone on Earth is energy rich. That would be our dream, our goal, our aspiration. I think it's the path we're headed on. 8 billion people, maybe someday 9 billion people, or a little bit more, that everybody gets to enjoy the kind of lives that I get to enjoy, that the lucky 1 billion of us take for granted. How is that not the goal? And I'm going to say, let's hope it is achieved and that can be a future declaration or theme of Super Spiked. I think it's worth spending a moment on what we're going to call the core tenets of energy pragmatism. And maybe I'll pull up these first few bullets. And we've emphasized this regularly, is that you have to respect energy's actual hierarchy of needs, not the inverted version that put climate as the number one goal, and I think led to a whole bunch of bad outcomes, including, by the way, not really moving the needle on emissions in the first place. All anyone cares about is energy availability. That is proven time and time and time again. That's followed by affordability and geopolitical security, and you have to solve for all these things. And then ultimately, there is a goal, and no one's saying there's not, to care about the environment, including climate and carbon emissions, but you got to get the ordering right. I don't believe it's a trilemma. When people use that language, trilemma, they're putting an equal weight on these things. It's not an equal weight. All anyone ever cares about is availability first and foremost. It can never be forgotten. You got to get the hierarchy of needs correct. And I will say the other core tenet that goes with it is that all of the above includes not just the traditional stuff, but also the new stuff. You're not going to have billion person scale economies get to become energy rich, if you will, get to achieve their economic hopes and dreams without a whole bunch of the new stuff. There will absolutely be an imperative to figure out what comes next, and that is what we spend all of our time on. Another core tenet of pragmatism is that every country does, will, and should put their country first. America first has become a slogan, and I'm excited to see that I think we're going to get to Canada first, Europe first. China for sure adheres to this. They absolutely put China first. I think India is adhering to it. And I would contrast that with this notion of, quote, global cooperation. And let me be clear, I am not saying Fortress America, Fortress Canada. We absolutely should be trading with each other, figure out economies of scale, trading with your allies, ensuring you're not too dependent on your adversaries and so forth. But the idea that you would want a body like the United Nations deciding either explicitly or implicitly energy policy for the world, that is what I'm going to push back on. It never made sense. And we try not to single out people in super spiked, but look at the leader of the UN. Look at his statements on, he's the global boiling guy. They are ridiculous. They are nothing that any American should want their country subject to. I would push back hard that any country, let alone the country I'm in, America, would want to have any sort of impact from folks like that or their organizations. Another one, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. We already spent a lot of time on it. This global cooperation, bunch of nonsense, in my opinion. Doesn't mean you don't get along, doesn't mean you don't have diplomacy, doesn't mean there aren't things you should be doing together. But it is absolutely your country first. And competition, capitalism, markets, technology is the way, in my opinion, to better paths going forward. And I'll contrast that with mandates, regulation, and I'm going to say socialism. The American style of economy, I will take all day over, say, the direction Europe has been headed in. And I said it in our post last week. My prayer is always, please, American Electric, do not ever turn us into Europe. We do not want to be New Europe West. Capitalism, markets, technology, and competition, I think will help resolve our energy issues going forward. So let me shift to what is the purpose of this video this week, which is the opportunity zones we see, areas that perhaps have either been left behind or were on a not so great path, where I think this new theme of energy pragmatism really creates, we should be giving them a fresh look. And let me start with Europe. This is where we've had the loudest voices on net zero is all that matters. And we don't need to go through all the names again, but the people who push this know who they are. It's led to deindustrialization. It's led to economic stagnation. It's led to Europe really falling off, especially versus the US, but also some of the developing world in terms of their economic relevance. And you're starting to see code red. If Germany, the traditional heart of Europe, is potentially going to go through its third year of economic contraction, it has to be a wake-up call that things need to change. With all that said, Europe is a region that is very dependent on energy imports. So this isn't about fossil fuels need to come back to Europe on its own. It's going to have to be a blend of the old stuff and the new stuff. They're going to need their version of all of the above, but I think Europe is clearly getting a wake-up call, and you're starting to see some shifts amongst their electorate based on elections. This opportunity in Europe and the situation in Europe is very different than, say, Canada. And so the case of Canada, which super spiked readers and viewers know I've generally had a very favorable view of the Canadian energy sector and still do. But Canada is energy dominant in the sense that it has got massive oil, gas, and other minerals and resources that are well in excess of and have been well in excess of their domestic needs. It's a relatively smaller population. I want to say 40 or 45 million people, and the amount of oil and gas they produce today, let alone what they could produce, is well in excess of that. But they obviously have a geopolitical dependence on the United States, and the Trump tariff proclamations, I know, was deeply upsetting to, as best as I can tell, all Canadians. And I think what I'd say is this going to be a catalyst to change to where under the last decade, under the Trudeau administration, Canada was not as bad as Europe, but had that sort of climate only mindset and tried their best to, I think, kind of keep in the ground the best intentions and efforts of their Canadian oil and gas sector, mostly in the province of Alberta. There is a need to drill and build in Canada. And I do hope that irrespective of even if Trump were to decide he didn't want to move forward with tariffs, or in some future year, there's a different president who's not as tariff focused, even in that environment, there's a huge opportunity in Canada to drill and build and to help meet the world's energy needs. There's always going to be, I think, a very close integration with the US. That is needed for our country. It's needed for Canada as well. But there is a real opportunity to figure out additional ways to provide the world the energy it needs, and going west, frankly, to building out an LNG sector. I think we remain very hopeful and optimistic that Canada will have a more robust path going forward in terms of their energy sector. The last area is California. And this one, frankly, is the one that is most baffling. California is not an independent country trying to resolve its own geopolitical challenges. It is, through deep research we've done at SuperSpiked, it is actually one of our 50 states. And so I think it is absolutely settled science that California's problems are man-made. They're 100% man-made. And people vote for who they vote for. We've had very tragic fires, massive devastation. But we've been struck by the fact that we've seen a lot of attention from people, a lot of citizen anger focused on fire and water management, the efficacy of the political leaders in California to handle crises and to anticipate things, and all of those kind of issues, as opposed to just blaming, quote, climate, which easily could have been attacked that California went down. Will this end single party rule? And I'm going to go through some slides in a moment, but California has historically been quite prospective from a traditional energy standpoint. And we know it also houses Silicon Valley and the leading technology companies. There's a real opportunity for California to become an energy giant, both in the old stuff and in the new stuff. But it does require the end of single party rule. I mean, the irony is, if there's a case for diversity, it is actually in California, where that progressive ideology could use some feedback from people who think a little differently. Let me go through some examples at the country level, how different choices and incentives and market structure have impacted geopolitical security and quite frankly, the economic health of these regions. So I got 6 kind of countries or regions here: US, Canada, Europe, Russia, Saudi, and Iraq. And if you go back to 2000, 25 years ago, it really struck me when I did this graph how close US European production were back then, and frankly, only a little bit smaller than Saudi. This is total liquids. It says oil here, but it's total liquids, and Russia overall. Now, of course, in those days when the US was just under 8 million barrels a day, our demand was still 18 to 20 million. So we were a major producer, but didn't feel like it because our imports were so large. And in fact, our import dependence about matched total Saudi production. And that was always that sense of the US is very dependent on the Middle East. And of course, in Europe's case, the sense has always been very dependent on Russia. And if you fast forward, this is 23 years, we're using Energy Institute data. Obviously, it's just a dramatic change. The growth in the US, of course, driven by shale. But if you started off for the first decade of this, they were going down a very similar path where US production through as recently as 2009, this period right here, no one anticipated that shale could so transform our future and our fortunes. And it came through some incentives in legislation, the Energy Act that President Bush passed. This growth has come from during the Obama, Trump, Biden, and administration. So across the political spectrum, we've had major growth. We also have a system where we have a lot of competition. This growth in the US did not come from the biggest companies. They did not spearhead it. It's the fact that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of independent producers, and we have people owning the land and owning the mineral rights and generally favorable fiscal terms, all of the whole package, that system of capitalism and competition and markets. Ultimately, when the geology was there and the incentives were there, you have this kind of growth. And contrast it with Europe. I mean, this, one can say or posit that the geology of the Permian Basin and the Bakken are better than anything Europe has, but are they even trying? Is there not shale in Europe? Is there not additional resource? So it's quite possible that Europe couldn't have matched our hockey stick forecast trajectory up. But this decline in European liquids production, it matches the general decline in Europe overall. This erosion in energy is consistent with erosion in economic well-being, and it is just dramatic. And as a result of their erosion, as a result of their, and I'm going to say misguided climate-only policies and trying to keep it in the ground, and then being dependent on only a handful of big companies, that all of which were getting yelled at to transition into only new stuff. You've now, Europe, become very dependent on Russia, which despite having its own challenges and wars and so forth, has at least sort of steadily grown their production over the last 23 years. How does that make sense? How does any of this make sense? Why would you yell at companies in your own country or region in the case of Europe? And we, as an American, look at how much better off we are to now be in an energy dominant position. Dramatic change in fortunes. I want to highlight one other dichotomy here, and it's actually Europe versus Canada. So again, you go back to 2000, Canada was a fraction of the size of Europe. And despite having an administration in Canada, the Trudeau administration, which I think by all accounts was pretty hostile to the oil and gas sector, you have a system of competition in markets and minerals ownership and fiscal regime that did allow their production to move higher despite federal government hostility, a system not dissimilar from what we have in the US. And it was 2011, 2012, where the lines crossed, where Canada passed Europe. What I find striking about Canada is the country they weren't trying, meaning there wasn't a national consensus or motivation. Let's figure out how we can get these providents to allow export infrastructure to the West. Let's figure out how we can motivate our version of an LNG expansion. And I think there's a lot of scope for Canada to, again, perhaps not match our level of hockey stick growth, but continue to be an even more important supplier to the world's energy needs. Again, look at the contrast with Europe, which has now been passed by Canada. And Canada, I would note, has actually beaten Iraq in terms of its oil supply growth. Again, I think very important from a geopolitical standpoint. Let's look at this now from a state's perspective. I'm going to focus on the US, and there's going to be some similar themes. I'll try and go through this a little quicker, but you go back to 2000, and I got 6 of our states or regions here: Alaska, California, New Mexico, and Texas emphasized, and then the Gulf of America, as it is now officially called, and North Dakota also on this graph. And if you start with Texas, Alaska, California, they were actually all sort of similarly sized. Texas was still the largest. And again, for a decade, no one spent any of their time thinking about the differences in production. They were all expected to be flat or slightly down. But it's, again, that same sense of you had lots and lots of independence in Texas, and the motivation and the business-friendly environment and attitudes there. That led to, when the time was right, the explosion upward in terms of Permian and Eagle Ford oil liquids growth. And everyone knows how well Texas as a state has done in terms of driving oil production. I can contrast that with Alaska and California. Again, you can always debate geology, willing to have that debate, but you have to at least try. You have to create the incentives by which a large swath of companies want to give it a go. Both California and Alaska are dominated by, there's only a handful of companies there. There's not the full spectrum of independent producers like you see in the state of Texas. And this video is not about trying to give them advice on exactly what they should be doing, but there is a lesson to be learned here. And in both cases, I suspect both Alaska and California could pick up to a degree that these lines have not yet demonstrated. And look at New Mexico. Again, I don't think anyone spent any time thinking about New Mexico 25 years ago. And they are now going to be our second largest area after Texas. So it does show when you have a system where there are lots of companies and competition and capitalism and business-friendly environments, you can do a lot better. And I think I will be hopeful that both Alaska and California can get to where they can start taking advantage of the resource that they're at least giving people a chance to try. So I'd like to now shift from countries and states to companies and just how we think about opportunities from this new energy pragmatism era. I'm going to start with the new energies because I don't want to forget about them or have them be an afterthought. And then I'll talk about some of the big oils on both sides of the Atlantic. But I've shown this graph before. It's Ørsted, Vestas, Neste, Siemens, and we've now added GE Vernova to it, their market caps. And of course, it was actually President Biden's inauguration when new energies peaked. Think about it. The IRA came after, into his administration. It was an administration very focused on new energies. The whole world, not just the Biden administration, but especially the US and Europe, very focused on, quote, the energy transition, and the IEA's put in net zero reports. And the market's an amazing discounting mechanism. It is anticipatory. And people anticipated that all that stuff was not going to change the underlying challenges of the business, and that perhaps things had gotten too bid up. And it's been only a straight line down for all things, quote, new energies. The question to me is, because I've said, we're going to need the new stuff if we're going to scale billion-person economies. We're not negative on new stuff just for the sake of it, but it has to scale. It has to be economic. You can't rely on subsidies forever. And that's what I think the market's trying to discern. And so, you fast forward through the end of 2024, and it continues to be continued pressures on some of these renewables and wind and so forth type companies, where I think people are concerned, hey, they seem very dependent on the subsidies. But look at the turnaround. Look at the turnaround in Siemens. And I don't mean to highlight just one company. We prefer to talk about sectors. But this is a company that had been subject to the downdraft, that is now this has been an early leader in the move towards energy pragmatism. It's clearly the natural gas value chain that both Siemens and, in the case of GE Vernova, are exposed to. And the market sniffed out, we are going to be concerned about these companies that need all these subsidies, where the economics don't actually make sense. But the world needs energy. AI is a thing. We can see what merchant power companies are doing, NVIDIA, all these types of things. What is going to be a winner? It's actually going to be gas turbine manufacturers. I think that's the spirit by which we are looking at a lot of the new energies. In an era where people are going to focus on real economics and want to minimize the amount of subsidies you face, but where countries like India and China and other billion-person scale economies are going to need a whole bunch of new energies, and we've got areas for improvement in the US and Europe and so forth, where amongst the carnage would you pick out? And listen, I did not say gas turbine manufacturers at the bottom of 2023 is what we should focus on. So I need to do better going forward. But I think we're going to continue to look at what are the areas that have been under pressure and who can have a turn. In these last 4 slides I want to go through, I want to quickly go through the big oil companies on both sides of the Atlantic as sort of the second set of companies. This is something I did spend the better part of my first 20 years spending a lot of time on. Who do you want to favor amongst some large group of major oils on both sides of the Atlantic? And we generally call this the super majors, the kind of the BP, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, Total. But I think we're going to just start calling them big oils. I'm going to say, to be a super major, you need to be a $1 trillion company. I think Aramco fits that bill, but today's Mag 7, they're $1 trillion companies. I believe in energy, in traditional energy. We will get back to having $1 trillion companies, but we don't yet. And let this serve as a motivation to all these companies. How do you get back to being a true stock market leader? And that means $1 trillion market cap. So we're just going to call them big oil right now. I think that's still a good term. And we wanted to add Equinor to the European lot because, frankly, they're about the same market cap as BP, and they're always interesting. I've always enjoyed engaging with them. And in doing so, I think for the US, we need to expand the list a little bit as well. So we're going to call it the US Big Three. We may add a fourth and fifth company as well, but at least for right now, we've got the US Big Three versus the European Big Four. And this is a free cash flow yield graph, free cash flow yield. The dark, super black, bluish line is the US free cash yield. The lighter one is Europe. On a free cash yield graph, it's on this x-axis, this y1 axis. If you have a lower free cash yield, that means your valuation's better. People are giving you more credit for your free cash flow if the yield is lower. When the yield is higher, investors are saying, hey, we're not so sure what you're going to do with these free cash flows, so we're not going to bid your equity up as much. We're a little concerned with where that money has gone. And of course, you can see this graph starts in 2010. For the first 7 or 8 years of that period, these companies traded very similarly. And you'll see in a moment, it makes sense. The returns and growth were very similar. Therefore, the valuation was very similar. It's only been since the market has started saying, we want to transition, that you need to transition, and where that pressure has been especially profound in Europe. BP went furthest. They're in the process of course correcting. Shell was going down in a BP-like path, and in 2023 changed management. And we've said publicly, we think they're now on a healthier track. And you can go name by name, but in general, a lot of pressure on European oils. And you see the gap in free cash yield really blew out to where the delta, which is the Y2 axis, you can see currently European oils have a 6 or 7% higher free cash yield, a cheaper valuation than do the US guys. And the question is it justified? And if they right size or change their strategies, could that close that gap? And we're not going to answer that question. That's up for investors and the professionals to figure out. But we just want to illustrate a few points here. First, if we look at cash on cash returns, US versus Europe, they're right on top of each other. So despite the concerns that European profitability would be worse, in actuality, the lines are right on top of each other. And I would note, you see the general downtrend here from the peak of the super cycle in the 2000s to the lows at COVID. The big improvement with Russia, Ukraine. I think investors, just to give one tangent, they're going to want this CROCI to be in the teens, no worse than kind of 12 or 13%. And no one expects more than 20% on a through cycle basis. But I think that is what companies and all these companies need to be aspiring to. But the CROCI is very similar. If we look at growth, and we're going to use growth and gross capital invested here, revenues in the oil business is very volatile because of pricing. So we're going to use a stable metric like your invested capital. Historically, the business has grown mid-single digit, or the companies have. That's a logical growth rate in the context of what is a mature sector. But again, similar to the returns, the growth used to be better, and they've all sort of gone ex-growth. That's what's kind of remarkable. So you've got a period here where the returns fell off and the growth fell off. The returns are better, but people are still not sure where it's going to settle out. And you have to have returns and growth. I think there's almost no question about that to be a $1 trillion stock market leader. And it's always been a challenge to do both in this sector, but these companies actually did do it during the last super cycle. But again, on growth, US and Europe, very similar. So when I go back to this gap in free cash yield, to me, it is explained primarily by the fact that people were calling for the Europeans to transition more, and they were articulating strategies that said they were going to transition and invest in a whole bunch of new stuff where people were not sure of the profitability. To the extent that's changing, and to the extent you have confidence it's changing, that to me would be the argument for narrowing this gap going forward. And then I think we have to see whether US or European, who's going to be able to do better on returns, who's going to be able to do better on growth. The final caveat I'd make, though, would be that when you're a really large company, even if you're not a Mag 7 stock, but you're still a large company, your local market cost of capital matters a lot for you as well. So this is the PE for the S&P 500 versus MSCI Europe. And so you can see there's been a big gap. And again, it's really been during this energy transition era where the US stock market is starting to do a lot better from a valuation perspective than Europe. This graph goes back to 2001. And while at times the US was a little bit more expensive on PE than the S&P, it is not a coincidence that when Europe got off track from their hierarchy of needs and started saying climate is all that matters and started having these nonsensical energy policies that you've seen its stock market valuation also lag. And it's not just climate, there's a whole bunch of different reasons as well. There's a broader trend towards regulation in Europe. But my point would be is when you go back to the super majors, some amount, or the big oils, some amount of that free cash flow gap is explained by the broader stock market. So it's not enough, probably, for simply BP, Shell, Total, and Equinor to give investors confidence in how the free cash flow is going to be used going forward. You actually probably need broader societal change within Europe and for the European markets in general to do better. And so we're not making a conclusionary call here that you should shift into the Europe. That is not the nature of Super Spiked. It's to point out that when you are talking about energy pragmatism and when we're talking about areas for opportunity, you really have to go deep on all these things. We don't want to oversimplify it to just, strategy choices around energy transition. It's more than that. The broader market context matters. And so maybe just some key conclusionary takeaways. When the macro changes, so does the opportunity set. We're going from a messy energy transition to the energy transition needs to transition to now the era of energy pragmatism. And therefore, the macro opportunities and where to invest cannot be the same that it was 4 or 5 years ago. And I think we're going to spend a lot of time thinking through that. It is about looking at micro subsector, company and asset specific analyses to figure out what is the risk reward. You have to go through the full spectrum. So what we just did for the super majors, I keep calling them super majors, big oils, we should do for Canada, we should do for California. As investors, you can pick different regions or opportunities. I would do it for all the new energies. Again, when we look at the inflection up in the gas turbine manufacturers, who's going to be next? We're going to need all forms of energy. What are the right assets? Who's got real economics? And who doesn't require too much subsidies? Energy, it's always changing. Maybe it's changing every 2 years in new and in unexpected ways. And we like the term perpetual transition. We are always having change. And that's going to be what we're going to spend our time going forward on with Super Spiked. It is no longer a messy energy transition era. It is the era of energy pragmatism, and we're really very excited about it. So I'd like to end this video on a personal note, and I loved this meme that came. So the NHL for their All-Star game had what they called a 4-nation face-off. It was a surprisingly long and in-depth tournament, and it's probably the best sort of all-star event that any of these sports have done in a long time, and you could see it in the passion of players. And I love this meme where, for NBA players, I can't play in back-to-back games because my knee's a little sore, whereas in the round robin portion of US versus Canada, you had 3 fights in the first 9 seconds. People were booing each other's national anthem. This was sort of just after the Trump tariff stuff. And this line of, in hockey, I am willing to die for my country in this exhibition really spoke to me in terms of the effort and the passion of hockey players versus what you might call the more coddled nature of NBA players. And I'll say, I used to try this philosophy of trying to have a hockey player's mindset is what I used to try to bring to my career at Goldman Sachs. I used to give the speeches to my colleagues in the research department. If you want work-life balance at Goldman Sachs, you should retire or go work somewhere else. When you're working at Goldman Sachs, you should want to kill yourself for the firm. It's an incredible opportunity to be here. And I try to live to that unless you're in the hospital, you should be trying to figure out how we can do the best research we can and to help our clients. Now, I will say, now here in my mid-50s and having been retired from Goldman for a decade and now starting up a little bit, I'm probably not as hardcore as that. But this hockey tournament is a reminder that is actually, I think, the right attitude. And while I probably won't be able to bring that full Goldman insane level of intensity to Super Spiked, I am trying to bring more of what it means to be a hockey player to everything I do. And just as a final point, I do want to say congratulations to the country of Canada for winning that 4 nations face-off. I know it's been a traumatic time. We at Super Spiked and at Veriton are huge fans of the Canadian energy sector. We're excited for the country's path going forward. And I do want to say congratulations for winning the 4-nation face-off. Thank you.